Hey, tonight we're not stepping into castles or royal banquets. We're not talking about knights or dragons. No, we're going to the bone-cold, breath-stealing heart of winter in the Middle Ages. A world without central heating, without running water, without anything even remotely resembling comfort. Just a bunch of tired, cold peasants trying to outlast a season that wasn't just cruel, it was relentless. Picture it, a smoky little hut with a sagging roof and walls that do more whispering than insulating. You're sleeping on a bed of straw, wearing the same clothes you worked in yesterday and the day before that. There's frost on the inside of your door, and the only thing separating you from the freezing night air is a patchy old cloak that smells like wet goat, and not in a nostalgic way. This is winter, the real winter. No snow globe romance, no cocoa by the fire. Just survival. Every single day. Now, if slow, gritty historical deep dives help you relax, or at least remind you how warm your apartment is, go ahead and hit that like button. Maybe even subscribe. And hey, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting in knowing who else is sitting in the dark, listening to old ghosts with me. All right, lights down, fan on, blanket over your shoulders. Let's go. Winter doesn't show up with a dramatic entrance. It doesn't roar in like a thunderstorm or slap you across the face with an ice-cold wind out of nowhere. No, it seeps in, quiet, subtle. First in your bones, then in the way the sky loses its color. Then in the silence, because the animals stop making noise. The wind starts slipping between the gaps in your walls, and you start to notice your own breath every time you exhale, curling like smoke in the air. Autumn doesn't end. It just pulls away. Leaves drift down. The light starts to fade, and the wind, it stops just rustling the trees and starts poking around inside your cottage. It finds every crack, every weak spot. It starts pushing your warmth out like a thief casing the place before the real job begins. The chickens get quiet. The dog who used to bark at every leaf now just sits there listening to the wind like it's whispering secrets. The sun, when it does show its face, feels weak, thin, like it's forgotten how to be warm. Everyone walks faster. Not because they're in a rush, but because standing still physically hurts now. And there's no announcement, no epic snowstorm to mark the beginning. Winter just arrives, like debt, quietly, but with consequences. The first stage of surviving winter denial. You pretend it's not that bad, that this is just a passing cold spell. You wear the same tunic you wore in October. Maybe throw on a cloak that's more patch than cloth. You say you'll fix it. You won't. The needle's bent. The thread's gone. Your fingers are too stiff to hold either. We love to talk about how medieval peasants were prepared. But let's be real. Winter always caught people mid-task. You meant to fix the roof. You didn't. Meant to chop more wood, didn't. Meant to dry more herbs, salt more meat, repair more shoes, all of it half done. So you make do. Stuff straw into the gaps in the walls. Hang cloth over the door. Move the beds closer to the hearth, even if that means sleeping next to Uncle Gain, who smells like sheep and mumbles about debts nobody remembers. You're not lighting fires all day, that's a luxury. Wood is rationed. Fires are for cooking, for the 1 hour in the evening when people pretend they're not cold. The rest of the time, you rely on layering, on movement, on the reluctant heat of multiple siblings jammed together under one scratchy, flea-bitten blanket. And the animals, oh, they know. They always know. The chickens stop laying. The pigs go silent, which is creepy, honestly. The cows grow even more irritable than usual. And outside the ground, it turns to iron. The path that was just a muddy mess last week is now a death trap. Ice ruts, half-frozen puddles. One bad step, and boom, twisted ankle. No doctor, just limping and regret. You wake up each morning to a bucket of water that's frozen solid. You break the ice with a spoon. You curse under your breath. The sky is a heavy, low gray blanket that presses down on everything. It looks like it's waiting for what you don't know, but you squint up at it like maybe, just maybe, you'll find a sign. You won't. The village changes too. People stop chatting. Conversations shrink. So do jokes. Smiles rare. The priest. He leans into the season his sermons get darker. He says the cold is God's way of teaching humility. You wonder if God might consider teaching with a little more sunlight next time. Then one morning it happens. Snow. Just a little. Not a blizzard. Just a dusting. Like someone spilled powdered sugar over the fields. But it changes everything. The trees stiffen. The thatch turns white. Your breath clouds the air. And every step outside sounds like parchment tearing. That's the moment, the lock-in, the moment you know you're not getting out. The earth has shut down for business. No more planting, no more digging. What you've stored is what you've got. And if what you've got isn't enough, well, you're about to get real familiar with just how thin soup can be. From here on, you don't count time in days. You count it in bundles. Bundles of firewood, sacks of grain, jars of whatever you manage to pickle. How many turnips left? How many eggs this week? None? Yeah. Chickens don't lay when they're trying not to freeze. You keep moving. That's the key, even when nothing feels productive. You mend clothes with numb fingers. Scrape the soot off the pans. Stir the ashes, hoping for one last ember. If you're lucky, you spin wool. Not because it's fun. Not even because you need thread. Just because it keeps your hands busy. Your mind, too. Too much silence. And the thoughts start to bite. The animals, some of them come inside. Not all at once. But the warm ones. The goats, yeah, they're in. Not because you like sleeping next to a goat, but because a goat is basically a four-legged radiator with bad breath. Evenings are the worst. The sun disappears like it owes you money. Candles are too expensive. Tallow lamps smell like regret. So you sit near the fire if it's burning, and you listen. To stories. To the wind. To the way the wood pops and snaps and sounds like someone whispering secrets in the dark. Someone always tells a ghost story. Always seems like a good idea. Until you have to cross the yard to the privy afterward. You run. You don't look at the shadows. You don't ask what made that noise. You just run. But here's the strange thing. Winter's not all misery. There's a rhythm. A bitter, predictable one. The chores, the cold, the hunger, they have a kind of structure. You learn to appreciate small victories. A warm pair of feet. A meal that doesn't taste like boiled sadness. A night without wind howling through the rafters. And when you laugh quietly, someone always says, "Don't get too happy. Winter's just getting started." And they're right. Historically, winter didn't just knock politely on the peasant's door. It barged in, kicked its boots off, and made itself at home. And if you weren't ready for it, and let's be honest, whoever really was, you were in for months of hardship that tested not just your strength, but your ability to stay sane while everything froze around you. And at the top of your medieval winter survival list would, not coins, not comfort wood, chopped, stacked dry, if you're lucky. Without it, you weren't surviving. You were shivering, starving, and maybe getting real familiar with what hypothermia felt like when your bones started whispering regrets. Fire was everything. It cooked your food. It kept your water from turning into ice sculptures. It dried your socks, scared away rats, gave your fingers a second chance at life, and somehow made your barely habitable hut a little less deadly. Without fire, you were just a frostbitten, tax-paying icicle with a goat roommate. But fire doesn't just appear. You've got to earn it. That means chopping, carrying, stacking, swearing, then chopping again, gathering firewood in the Middle Ages. That was your second full-time job. Except it didn't come with breaks, didn't pay, and definitely didn't offer dental. No chainsaw, no log splitter, no help from anything other than your battered old axe that's more rust than blade and probably older than your grandmother's ghost. The handle's cracked. The blade is dull, but it's all you've got. Well, that and your hands, which, let's face it, you'll be using when the ass inevitably gets stuck for the fifth time in the same stubborn log. You're supposed to start collecting wood in autumn. That's the plan. That's the theory. But plans don't always pan out. Maybe the harvest ran late. Maybe your neighbor borrowed your axe and forgot to return it. Maybe you spent 2 weeks limping from that time you tried to wrestle firewood out of a ditch and lost to gravity. Whatever the excuse, it's December now, and you're swinging steel in the snow like your life depends on it. Because it does. You chop down one tree. Feels like a victory. Until you realize you still have to cut it into pieces, haul it across frozen ground, and stack it somewhere semi-dry. Repeat this delightful process 50 times. If you're lucky, the only thing that breaks is your back. If you're not, the tree decides to land on your leg, and you become a cautionary tale for future generations. And even when the wood is chopped, it's not ready. It needs to dry. For months. So you burn it wet. That means smoke. So much smoke. The kind that seeps into your walls, your lungs, your soul. The fire hisses, spits, sulks. Your house turns into a miserable steam box that smells like despair and cough syrup, and still you sit next to it like it's a blessing. Because technically it is. Now, the rich, they don't chop wood. They pay someone else to risk frostbite and axe wounds. They sip wine beside a roaring fireplace. You're huddled around a smoking pile of twigs, hoping it decides to act like fire sometime before dawn. And don't get caught gathering wood in the wrong place. Forests belong to lords. That's right. You pick up sticks on noble land, and the punishment could be a fine, a beating, or getting thrown in the stocks to serve as an example. Yes, an example for gathering twigs. Welcome to feudalism. So, peasants got creative. They burned anything that vaguely resembled fuel. Peat, brush, even dried animal dung. Peat smells like sadness and soggy shoes when it burns. Dung, well, it gets the job done. But no one's lighting that fire and smiling. You're just trying not to inhale too deeply while you pray your eyebrows survive the night. You gather cow patties with frozen fingers and pretend they're logs. You tell yourself, at least it's free. Then spend the next 6 hours wondering why your cottage smells like a barn that caught fire. And stacking wood, that's its own nightmare. Stack it too tight. It molds. Too loose. It collapses and crushes your foot. So you build your lopsided woodpile beside the hut. Cover it with whatever tarp-like substance you manage to steal from your cousin, and hope the next snowfall doesn't bury it. But the golden rule of medieval firewood is simple. It's never enough. You could chop wood every day from September to December, and by February, you're burning fence posts, broken furniture, and that stool that nobody liked anyway. If it burns, it's valuable. No questions asked. You start to dream about firewood. You count logs like treasure. You have legit arguments with your spouse about who burned the good stick too early. And when you stumble across a dry branch hidden under snow, you drag it home like a war trophy. Sleeping during winter becomes a gamble. If the fire dies out, the temperature inside drops to hope you wrote a will, so you pile on layers, clothes, furs, blankets, children, goats. Anything with body heat becomes part of the bedding. And yes, livestock sleep inside, not for love, but for function. Chickens offer eggs and ambient warmth. Pigs are literal space heaters. Cows. Cows are walking radiators that moo at inconvenient hours. It's not cozy. It's chaotic, noisy, smelly. You're basically living inside a petting zoo that forgot to clean itself for 3 months. But hey, you're not freezing to death. And that counts as a win. Communities helped too. Sometimes. Villagers would band together to chop wood haul logs, share resources. It wasn't about bonding. It was about survival. Everyone was equally miserable. And sometimes that shared suffering made it slightly easier to handle. There were tricks, of course. Communal ovens to save fuel. Shared fires that ran all day. Bread baking rotations where everyone pretended not to notice that one house was always suspiciously warm. Agnes, we see you. Kids helped too. Small fingers, light feet. They were sent out with baskets to collect kindling. Pine cones, twigs, anything burnable. You didn't ask for oak. You asked for not wet and not stolen from the Lord's forest. Then there's the chopping itself. A sport made of pain. Gloves. Not really a thing. Your hands are raw. Splinters constant. The axe slips. The wood splits the wrong way. It hits your shin. You scream. Loudly. Not because it helps, but because it's all you've got left. By midwinter, the ground's too hard to dig into your fingers are more blister than skin. And your neighbor's suspiciously full woodpile looks more and more like you're missing half. Still, you keep going, because you have to. Fire is not optional. Fire is warmth. Fire is food. Fire is the difference between making it to spring or becoming a cautionary smell in someone else's memory. At night, when you finally sit down, sore half-frozen, covered in ash, and lightly smelling of pig smoke, you might feel something that almost resembles peace. Not comfort, just the absence of immediate doom, which in the Middle Ages is about as close to happiness as you're going to get. Let's talk about hunger. Not, I skipped lunch hunger. Not, I could go for a snack hunger. We're talking about the kind of hunger that makes you dream of chewing bark, that makes you stare at a shriveled turnip, like it's the centerpiece of a royal banquet. In a medieval winter, food was not something you planned. It was something you rationed, scraped, invented out of desperation, and whatever didn't rot first. You didn't dine, you survived. The bulk of your diet grains. Barley, oats, rye, wheat if you were rich or had very generous neighbors. You stored them in sacks, barrels, anything that could sort of keep the rats out. Spoiler, nothing kept the rats out. Those little demons were like furry tax collectors, always finding a way in, leaving behind destruction, and a smell you'd never forget. Most meals revolved around pottage, not a recipe, a concept, a life philosophy even. Pottage was a mystery stew that simmered for days, weeks sometimes. You added to it. You never started over. Onions, dried beans, scraps of carrot, a strip of bacon from 3 months ago if you were feeling luxurious. The longer it simmered, the less you remembered what went into it. It tasted like boiled regret, with a hint of something that might have once been green. And still, you ate it. Twice a day if you were lucky. Not for joy, not for flavor. Because it was there. Because it was warm. Because it was soup. And in winter, soup meant life. Meat. Forget about it. You didn't have a freezer. You didn't even have a cold cellar. just a slightly less freezing corner of your already freezing house. If you did slaughter an animal in the fall, a pig, a goat, that chicken with the attitude problem, you salted it, smoked it, dried it, then you hid it. From the neighbors, from the kids, from the husband who once ate the good sausage in his sleep. Fish only, if you were near a river that wasn't frozen solid, or if you were desperate enough to sit over a hole in the ice for hours, hoping for something to bite while your toes slowly detached from your body. Ice fishing was less of a tradition and more of a slow, damp form of punishment. And bread. Oh, bread was a gamble. You baked with whatever flour you had. Rye oats barley, sometimes lentils, sometimes filler like sawdust or acorn meal. Bread wasn't fluffy or warm or inviting. It was a weapon. A stale, rock-hard disc you had to soften in your soup or risk dental disaster. Some loaves were so dense you could use them to hammer nails or stop a burglary. And that's assuming your bread didn't turn on you. Ever heard of ergot? It's a lovely fungus that grows on rye and makes you hallucinate, convulse, and sometimes die. You didn't know it by name. All you knew was that one minute you were eating a sandwich, and the next you were seeing angels in the rafters or screaming at your shoes for betrayal. Medieval food was a gamble in every bite. Milk. Not unless your cow hadn't frozen escaped or been eaten by wolves. You'd turn it into butter if you could, or cheese. But cheese wasn't the delicious, creamy miracle you know today. It was hard, salty, a wedge of edible cement that you gnawed on like an animal. Butter was wrapped in cloth and hidden like treasure. You used it sparingly, if at all. It was more valuable than some family heirlooms. Eggs chickens weren't laying. They were too busy trying not to die. If you got one egg a week, you celebrated. Or you stared at it for so long that you swore it made you full just by looking at it. Then you put it in the pottage and called it gourmet. Fresh fruits and vegetables. That's adorable. You might have a shriveled apple from last August if you were lucky. Or a dried plum that looked more like a fossil than food. Most of your vitamins came from fermented cabbage or pickled turnips, which tasted like vinegar-drenched failure. But hey, at least you weren't getting scurvy. Preservation was everything. You dried, salted, smoked, and pickled anything you could. Berries were turned into jam if you didn't eat them all during a sugar-starved breakdown in summer. You hung herbs from the ceiling until they dried, dropped into your soup, and got stirred in with a shrug. You boiled bones twice, saved every bit of fat, scrubbed pots with ashes. If you dropped a crust of bread, you picked it up and said a little prayer of thanks before eating it anyway. Waste wasn't an option. If someone threw food away, you didn't get mad, you questioned their sanity. Or you married them because clearly they were wealthy enough to waste food. Hunger itself became a part of life. A roommate you didn't invite but couldn't evict. It sat with you at meals, watched you cook, commented on your portion size. You chewed slowly, not for taste, but for time. You made one bowl of soup last an hour. You scraped every last bit from the pot. You licked your fingers not out of gluttony, but because flavor was fleeting. Even the better off didn't eat well. They just ate slightly more of the same bland sadness. Maybe they had more dried meat, more cheese, or some actual honey for special days. But joy wasn't in the flavor. It was in the fact that you were chewing something real. And when the bad years hit, the famine years, food became legend. You remembered the stories of the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, when rain ruined crops, when livestock starved, when entire villages disappeared, not from war, from hunger. People ate moss, roots, bark, shoes, and when that wasn't enough, Well, history gets very quiet about the rest. Cannibalism was whispered. Families made impossible choices. Some stories were never written down. They just echoed in the silence of empty chairs. So you boiled the same roots. You ate the same stew. You didn't ask what was in it. You just hoped it wasn't the neighbor's dog. When you found food, it was cold. The fire had gone out. You huddled under a fur that still smelled like the animal it came from, and you were grateful. You scraped your bowl clean because every crumb counted. You considered eating the bowl, then remembered it was your only one. Your body changed. You moved slower. You lost weight. You didn't call it dieting. You called it still alive, and yet you kept going. Hunger didn't stop you. It just followed you. Quiet, constant, a reminder that in a medieval winter, meals weren't about fullness. They were about getting to the next one. There were no feasts. Maybe a saved sausage for Christmas. A pie with questionable meat. You didn't ask questions. You smiled. You swallowed. You pretended it was delicious. Even holiday food was practical. Spiced ale if you had spices. Nut cakes if you had nuts. Dried fruit soaked in syrup and desperation. These weren't indulgences. They were rituals. Reminders that joy used to exist. So what did you eat in a medieval winter? Anything that wouldn't eat you first. Anything you could salt, smoke, hide, or chew until it gave up. Because eating wasn't just about nutrition. It was resistance, defiance, proof that you were still here. And when spring finally came, when the first green shoot broke through the dirt, you didn't admire it. You bit it. Your home in the Middle Ages wasn't cozy. It wasn't protective. It wasn't even all that effective at being a house. Think of it more like a suggestion. Wooden beam straw, a whole lot of prayer, and the general hope that the next gust of wind wouldn't bring the roof down. Let's start with the walls. If you were lucky, they were wattle and daub. That's woven sticks smeared with mud, straw, manure, and whatever else could stick. You packed it together, slapped it on, and hoped it hardened before the next rain. Sometimes it did. Most of the time, not so much. On a good day, it just let the breeze whisper through. On a bad day, the breeze screamed and brought half the wall with it. Insulation, please. There was no such thing. It was you, a few handfuls of moss shoved into the cracks, and a resigned attitude. The idea of indoors was more theoretical than functional. Your roof thatched. Always thatched. Sounds charming, right? Except it was just dried straw, bundled and tied together, layered like a haystack, pretending to be a lid. It leaked constantly. When it rained, you didn't wonder if water would come in. You just wondered where. Snow piled on top, like it owned the place. Birds nested in it. Rats made it their winter retreat. Sometimes you'd hear something scratching up there and just pull the blanket over your head like that was going to help. The floor, dirt. That's it. Packed down earth. In summer, it turned to dust that settled on everything. In winter, it froze. When it rained, it turned into mud that never dried. You could try laying down straw to help, but that lasted maybe a day before turning into a moldy, soggy mess that smelled like wet dog and lost hope. Windows glass was a fantasy. If your house had holes in the walls, you'd stretch oiled parchment over them to let in a sliver of light and an entire army of drafts. If not, you just left the holes open and hoped the wind didn't develop a personality. The door didn't latch properly. It sagged on hinges that groaned like they had opinions. You could barricade it with a log, unless, of course, you'd already burned that log to keep the room above freezing. Priorities. And let's talk about the fire. Central to everything, but not in the gather round the hearth kind of way. It was a pit, a smoky, unreliable pit in the middle of your house. No chimney, just a hole in the roof. So the smoke. It didn't so much leave as linger. It wrapped around your head, soaked into your clothes, your bedding, your soul. You didn't smell it after a while. You were it. Breathing deeply indoors was a risk. You lived in a constant haze. Your lungs probably gave up long before your body did. Furniture minimal. A bench, maybe a table. A stool, if you were doing well. Beds were shared parents, children, maybe a goat or two if things got really cold. You didn't sleep in pajamas. You slept in your clothes, all of them. Under blankets, cloaks, furs, anything that didn't already smell too awful. You hoped that layering yourself in fabric and body heat would be enough. It usually wasn't. The mattress, a sack stuffed with straw, which sounded better than it felt. It flattened fast, attracted insects, and molded quicker than your last batch of cabbage. Your pillow, another sack, or just your arm. Either way, neck pain was part of the lifestyle. Blankets were valuable. Wool, if you had it, furs, if something nearby died recently. You wrapped yourself in everything you owned and prayed the fire didn't go out. If it did, you woke up with your eyelashes frozen together. Heating the place wasn't just about the fire. It was about desperation. You sealed cracks with moss, plugged holes with rags, rearranged furniture to block drafts. Sometimes it worked. Most of the time, it didn't. The wind always found a way in. It knew you by name. The fire helped, but it played favorites. Heat rose, smoke rose, and you slept on the ground. So your rafters got a nice steam bath, while your toes froze into little medieval popsicles. Some folks tried heating stones near the fire, placing them near the bed. But again, that only worked if you had enough fuel to warm the stones to begin with. Light was another luxury. Candles made from tallow, that's beef fat in case you forgot, burned low, sputtered often, and stank like you were cooking regret. If you didn't have candles, you used rushlights, basically reeds dipped in grease. They burned fast, dim, and filled the room with the scent of something halfway between smoke and despair. Noise always there. Walls were thin. You heard everything. The wind howling, the livestock snorting, the neighbors sneezing, your spouse's stomach growling loud enough to wake the chickens. Privacy was a myth. Solitude that only happened if you wandered off into the forest and never came back. And it wasn't just people living inside. The animals joined you. Chickens nested in the corners. Goats lounged under the table. Cows, if it got too cold, were brought into the house proper, not for decoration, for survival. They shared heat even if they also shared noise, stink, and an uncanny ability to fart directly into your dreams. You swept the dirt floor, not to clean, but to rearrange it. You hung herbs to mask the smell. They dried, crumbled, fell into your soup. You ate them anyway. Flavor wasn't the goal, survival was. Your roof had its own ecosystem. Birds, insects, rats. In spring, the whole thing turned into a wildlife documentary. You heard tiny feet skittering overhead, and occasionally one would fall through. The rat screamed. You screamed. Then you both pretended it didn't happen. Repairs were constant. Things bent, cracked, broke. You fixed what you could with what you had, which was usually a rock, a splinter, and a lot of cursing. Nails were expensive. So you jammed wood together with sheer willpower and twine that came from who knows where. Leaks. You didn't fix leaks. You lived with them. You positioned buckets under drips and memorized their locations like landmarks. You gave the worst leaks nicknames. You cursed them when they woke you up dripping into your only dry blanket. You slept around them. You became one with the rhythm of the drip. And yet somehow, there were warm moments when the fire burned right, when the wind calmed down, when someone shared a wool cloak, or you found a dry patch of floor to sit on. You convinced yourself you were warm even if you weren't. You told yourself the air wasn't that smoky, that the roof wouldn't collapse tonight. You whispered to your house like it could hear you. Just one more week, one more month. This wasn't a home in the sense we think of today. It was a structure you maintained out of necessity. It held your memories, your fears, your family. It held the heat for just long enough to let you believe it was working. Barely. Wealthier peasants might whitewash their walls, not for decoration, but to kill lice. Lime killed bugs. It also made the house look brighter. Not warm, but maybe less miserable. You thought about doing it, maybe even collected some lime. But then the firewood ran out again, and the lime went back in the corner, waiting for a better year. You dreamed of a second room, of a roof that didn't shudder with every gust of wind, of a floor that didn't squish or smoke. You didn't expect it, but the dream helped, because this hut, this smoky, crumbling, frozen excuse for shelter, it was still standing. And that made it luxury. It's barely morning. The sky's a gray smear over the hills, and you can't tell if it's dawn or just another version of darkness. Either way, the day's begun. Not because you feel ready, not because your body's rested or your soul's at peace, but because in the Middle Ages, if you didn't start moving, something would go very wrong. The cold didn't care how tired you were. The chores didn't either. First job, the fire, always the fire. If you're lucky, you still have embers from the night before. You pray they survived under the ash. You blow on them. You fan them. You whisper things to them you wouldn't say to your spouse. If they catch, you've bought yourself another few hours of warmth. If not, it's back to flint and steel, hunched over kindling with fingers that can barely move. Firewood is precious. You use it sparingly. You don't get cozy flames. You get survival flames, small, smoky, and reluctant, just enough to keep the room from freezing your breath to the wall. Once the fire's started, it's time for water. That means stepping outside into a world that's still frozen solid. Your bucket is heavy. The ground is ice. The path to the stream is a gauntlet of slippery regret. You fall, you spill, you curse everything from God to gravity. Then you do it again, because no one else is going to. Back inside, you boil the water. Not because you're aiming for hydration perfection, but because medieval water was a lottery of bacteria and regret. Boiling kills the bugs, also warms your hands, also steams the hut a bit, which is the closest thing to therapy you'll ever experience. Next, animals. They come before you. Chickens need feeding. Pigs need slop. The cow who's been glaring at you since dawn needs hay. You scrape together what you can find, frozen scraps, wilted greens, leftover porridge, and hope it's enough. You open the coop. No eggs again. Just offended clucking and one rooster who clearly thinks he's in charge. If it snowed overnight, you shovel the path. Not for neatness, but because slipping with a bucket of pig slop in your hands is both painful and humiliating. You use a flat plank or an old board. Your gloves are wet. Your sleeves are frozen. You swear under your breath like it's the only warmth you've got left. With the animals fed and your hands halfway thawed, it's time for breakfast, which is optimistic. What you actually get is leftover stew, if there is any, or bread so tough you have to soak it in hot water to bite it. You eat in silence, not out of reverence, but because everyone's too tired to pretend it tastes like anything other than suffering. Then it's back to work. If you're a man, it's the fields, the forest, or the forge. If you're a woman, it's everything else. Cooking, spinning, hauling, mending, nursing, scraping soot, making sure the children don't freeze or accidentally burn down the house. And often you're doing it with a baby strapped to your back and three more screaming at your feet. Fixing the roof. That's your job. Fetching water again. Also your job. Checking if the goat escaped or froze to death. Guess what your job? There's no delegation, no rest, just a rolling wave of necessity crashing into your already exhausted spine. Laundry day is its own special torment. You haul clothes to the river, break the ice, and scrub with ash and lye until your knuckles bleed. You rinse, you wring, you lay things out to freeze dry in the sun that doesn't warm anything. Cooking is a lesson in humility. The pot you used yesterday is the same one today. You stir, what's left, skim the mold. Add water and pretend it's soup. You might toss in some herbs, maybe a scrap of something that used to be edible. You serve it hot because warmth is more important than taste. Afternoons are for repairs. The fence is falling. The gate's jammed. The ladder creaks like it's filing a complaint. You sharpen tools with a rock older than your family line. You tie things together with twine with hope, with sheer spite. The children help theoretically. Mostly, they chase chickens and ask for food. Still, you give them tasks. Gather kindling. Hold this yarn. Stand in that spot and don't breathe too loud. In winter, even a toddler can be part of the workforce. Inside, the spinning never stops. Wool doesn't spin itself. Every thread you wear passed through aching hands. Gloves are for nobles. You've got calluses. If you drop your spindle and it rolls into the fire, you stare at it for a second and think about how much it would cost your soul to go in after it. By late afternoon, the light's already fading. You rush. Patch the door. Fix the roof. Check the leaks. Rearrange the buckets under the drip spots. You don't do it because you expect to win. You do it because not trying would make it worse. You stir the evening stew. Stoke the fire. Add a new log and whisper a quiet prayer to it. You slip into what counts as warmer clothes, usually just more layers of the same worn-out garments. The weight of your outfit could crush a lesser person, but at least your knees aren't frozen. Dinner comes and goes quickly. A bit of stew, a crust of bread, maybe a sip of weak ale or boiled water. You eat by firelight, dodging sparks, sharing space with 5 people and 1 large goat. After dinner, the work doesn't stop. You mend socks. You patch cloaks. You spin more wool. You scrape the soot off the inside of the water bucket. You whisper jokes if there's energy. Sometimes someone sings. Not loudly, not joyfully, but just enough to remind everyone they're not alone. Children fall asleep in a pile of limbs and blankets. Adults stay up because the fire needs feeding, and someone has to make sure the hut doesn't spontaneously fall apart. Night comes fast. You lie down in the same straw sack you woke up in wearing the same clothes. You listen to the wind. You hear the house creak. You pray nothing leaks. And then you fall asleep, not out of peace, but because your body simply gives up. And that's just one day. Tomorrow the same. Again and again. No weekends. No breaks. No vacations. Just the same list of chores with slightly different weather. Holidays are a lie. You might go to church. You might hear a sermon about how your suffering makes you holy. Then you go home and catch up on the work you missed while praying for mercy. The rhythm of medieval winter isn't poetic. It's survival, set to the beat of fatigue. You don't do chores because you love them. You do them because the cost of not doing them is someone going hungry, or cold, or worse. A broken tool could mean no firewood. A torn cloak could mean frostbite. Every tiny task is a lifeline. And even then, You're always one mistake away from disaster. Still, you push on. Not because you're brave, because there's no one else to carry the water, mend the wool, or stir the stew. This is your life. This is your winter. And the chore list doesn't end. You dream of rest, of warmth, of a world where your hands aren't raw and your boots aren't full of holes. But dreaming costs energy, and you need that for tomorrow. So you shift your blanket, you glance at the fire, you listen to your baby snore, and your spouse whispers something to the goat, and then you sleep. Not to recharge, just to survive another day. You don't plan to get sick in the Middle Ages. It just happens. One day, your nose won't stop dripping. Your joints feel like they've been stuffed with gravel, and your throat decides to transform into a pine cone. Congratulations, you're officially sick. And in winter, that's about the worst luck you can have next to running out of firewood. Getting sick wasn't unusual. It was almost expected. The air in your hut was thick with smoke mildew and whatever the goat dragged in. You slept in damp clothes, huddled next to 4 people and 2 animals. There were no windows, no real ventilation, and no such thing as germ theory. But your body knew. Your body always knew. Everyone was coughing. The children, the elders, the cow probably. No one covered their mouth. Not because they were rude, but because you couldn't waste cloth on handkerchiefs, and your hands were too busy holding on to whatever was next on the chore list. Illness just spread, quietly, efficiently, like it was on a mission. The treatment was a whole different horror story. Step 1. Bleeding. Yes, bleeding. Have a headache. Cut your arm. Fever, drain some blood. Sore back. Better. Let the sickness out through your veins. Whether it was done with a knife or with a cheerful sack of leeches, it was the go-to cure for centuries. Did it work? No. Did it make you woozy enough to forget the pain for a while? Kind of. Step 2. Herbs, which meant a random collection of whatever the village healer had scraped together before the frost killed everything. Wormwood, nettle, yarrow, if it sounded unpleasant, and grew in a ditch, someone swore it had healing powers. You'd boil it in a cracked pot, strain it through whatever wasn't already being worn as a scarf, and sip the resulting tea, like it wasn't just a cup of bitterness and broken dreams. Sometimes it helped. More often, it just made your mouth taste like moss and disappointment. Step 3. Fasting, because clearly the best thing for a sick, starving body is less food. That wasn't medicine. That was just running out of ingredients and pretending it was holy. Other remedies: steam. From the same pot you cooked stew in, you'd hunch over it with a blanket over your head, inhaling boiled cabbage fumes and pretending you were getting better. Spoiler, you weren't. There were also prayers, long ones, desperate ones. You begged every saint whose name you remembered to spare you. If that didn't work, someone might try burning herbs in the corners of the hut or hanging iron over the doorway to ward off evil spirits. It didn't help, but at least it made the place smell marginally better. If the village priest showed up, you got holy water and a serious talk about whether your illness was a punishment for something you did. If the barber surgeon showed up, you got a rusty saw and a strong suggestion to bite down on something wooden. The barber carried a sack of tools that looked like they were stolen from a medieval torture chamber. He didn't believe in germs. He believed in humorous fluids in your body that needed balancing. And if yours were out of balance, well, maybe you needed something removed. A tooth, a toe, a whole limb if things were really out of hand. He was always smiling. You weren't. Purging was another common solution, as in, let's get it out of both ends. Vomiting was encouraged. Laxatives were handed out like candy. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was getting the illness to leave by force. Sometimes the cure felt worse than the disease. Okay, most of the time. But even after all that, some people did recover. You lay in your straw bed for days, sweating, shivering, hallucinating. You didn't eat. You barely drank. The room swirled with the smell of wet wool smoke and boiled weeds. But eventually, if you were lucky, the fever broke. You opened your eyes, and your breath didn't rattle. Your fingers moved again. The fire was still burning. And for the first time in days, the world looked a little less like a blur. That didn't mean you were okay. Recovery was slow. Your legs felt like sticks. Your stomach didn't want food. Your skin ached from just existing. You stood up too fast and nearly passed out into the ashes. But you were alive, barely. And that meant it was time to get back to work. No one clapped. No one threw a feast. You just got back to chores with a cough and a limp, and the knowledge that your woodpile hadn't grown while you were dying. Meanwhile, sickness didn't stay politely confined to one person. It spread. The hut was small. The air was stale. Someone coughed. Someone else sneezed, and before you knew it, half the family was laid out groaning under the same lice-infested blanket. The village caught on fast. Everyone was sick. Everyone was worried. And everyone had a theory. Maybe it was the bad air. Maybe someone angered a saint. Maybe old Maud muttered something nasty at church and cursed the town. Superstition was survival logic when science didn't exist. So people lit candles, hung herbs over doors, slept with knives under their pillows. It didn't work. Of course it didn't. But at least it felt like doing something. The worst part, you couldn't stop. You were sick, but the cow still needed milking. The fire still needed wood. The kids still needed food, even if it was just watery pottage and a stern warning not to touch the herbs drying over the fire. You didn't get to lie in bed until you felt better. You got up. You limped. You stirred the stew with a shaking hand and hoped no one noticed the cough you'd been trying to muffle for hours. Because sometimes sickness didn't leave. Sometimes it stayed, got worse. The fever climbed. You couldn't stand. You stopped eating. Someone draped a damp cloth over your forehead and hoped it helped. The fire burned low. The priest came. You didn't ask for him. He just showed up like a funeral in waiting. He knelt beside you, whispered prayers in Latin, sprinkled holy water that smelled faintly of mildew and despair, told you to confess. You did every sin you could remember, even the ones you weren't sure counted, just in case. Your family stood nearby, not speaking, not crying, just waiting, hoping, wondering if you'd make it. Sometimes you did. Sometimes, miraculously, the fever broke and you started to eat again. You got up, slowly. You moved like you were made of sticks and string, but you lived. Other times, you didn't. And if you died, there wasn't always a proper burial. The ground was frozen. The graveyard was full. You might be wrapped in cloth and stored in a barn until the thaw, or buried shallow under snow with a stone to mark the spot and prayers to keep the wolves away. Either way, you were gone, and the world moved on, because survival in the Middle Ages didn't allow time for mourning. There were still chores to do, still mouths to feed, still winter to endure. You didn't talk about it afterward, not really. You whispered a name, lit a candle. You kept going. Because that's what the living did. You coughed, you limped, you prayed, you patched the roof, and you waited for spring. Authority in the medieval world wasn't up for debate. It didn't ask for your opinion. It didn't take questions. It didn't care if you were cold tired or halfway through digging your own latrine. If someone higher up said jump, you didn't ask how high, you just started jumping, and prayed they weren't in the mood to make an example out of someone. At the top of this unwelcome hierarchy sat your lord, the manor, lord landowner, tax collector, justice dispenser, and professional ruiner of days. He owned everything. The fields you plowed his, the forest you dared not cut wood from his, the house you struggled to keep from collapsing. Technically his too. You were borrowing your entire existence. Disobeying wasn't an option. If you made him angry, even just by being too slow to bow when he rode past on his shiny mud-free horse, he could punish you. Publicly, brutally, and often creatively. Ever heard of the stocks? Imagine being locked into a wooden frame by your neck and arms in the middle of the village square in the middle of winter, while everyone who ever held a grudge walks by with a frozen turnip and perfect aim. That's medieval justice. Painful, humiliating, and freezing. But if the Lord was the stick, the church was the carrot. Except the carrot was also a stick, just with more Latin and incense. The church ran your calendar, your diet, your morality, your guilt. You went to Mass, even when it was so cold, inside the stone chapel, that your teeth chattered louder than the choir. You fasted when they told you to, even if it meant giving up meat, during the 1 month you actually had any. You confessed sins you didn't even know were sins, just to be safe. And you paid. Oh, you paid. Tithes weren't donations. They were mandatory. 1/10 of everything you owned went to the church. 1/10 of your grain, your eggs, your animals, your time. Didn't matter if your kids were hungry. Didn't matter if the crops failed. God still wanted his share. And the priest made sure he got it. Fall short. You didn't get a reminder. You got a sermon. Loud, personal, public. Delivered with all the passive-aggressive fury of a man who hadn't had to chop wood in a decade. And if you dared question anything, why Father Thomas had extra rations, why the altar cloth was made of better fabric than your only shirt, you'd find yourself under spiritual investigation, which could escalate into legal trouble. Because the church didn't just own your soul. It had influence over the law. And the law, like everything else, wasn't built to protect you. It was built to keep you in your place. Steal a loaf of bread. You could lose a hand, talk back to a noble tongue removed, gossip too loudly about the wrong person. Here's your scold's bridle, a charming iron mask with a metal bit for your mouth. Functional, fashionable, and a nightmare to remove once frozen to your skin. Even your family wasn't safe from your mistakes. If your child misbehaved, you got blamed. If your spouse cursed during an argument, you both got hauled in front of the priest for moral correction. Discipline wasn't personal. It was communal. You didn't get to fail quietly. You failed in front of everyone. And don't get clever. Intelligence was dangerous. Reading was for clergy. Curiosity was for witches. Asked too many questions, and suddenly people were whispering about how you had strange ideas, how you spent too much time alone, how you once made tea without asking a saint's permission. Being a woman. Even more rules. You obeyed your father, then your husband, then your son. That was the order. Didn't matter if you were the smartest person in the village. If you spoke too loudly, too confidently, or at all during Mass, you were a threat. And threats got dealt with. You could be accused of witchcraft for anything. Knowing how to heal a wound with herbs, owning a cat, singing to yourself, talking back, having dreams, all suspicious, all punishable. And once someone whispered witch, there was no unhearing it. The church didn't have to prove you were guilty. You had to prove you weren't. And in a world without lawyers, that was tricky. Then there were your neighbors. You'd think fellow peasants would band together, support each other. Not exactly. Everyone watched everyone. Because in a village that barely survived each winter, trust was rationed tighter than firewood. The man who smiled at you in the morning might report you by nightfall. The woman who borrowed your cooking pot might also tell the priest she saw you working on a feast day. People had long memories and short patience. There was no privacy, no secrets. Someone always saw. Someone always heard. The church encouraged it. The lords encouraged it. Mutual surveillance kept everyone in line. And in winter, everything got worse. People were hungrier, angrier, less patient. The smallest infraction, a borrowed stick of firewood, a bad trade, an offhand joke, could explode into scandal. Grudges lasted generations. Families feuded over goats. One wrong move and suddenly half the village was whispering about you. And the priest was concerned for your soul. There was no appeal, no court, no higher authority to step in and sort things out. Justice came from whoever had power that day, and that power was absolute. Even laughter was risky. Laugh too loudly at the wrong thing, suspicious. Laugh during mass, dangerous. Laugh at someone in the stocks. Acceptable, encouraged even. So you learned to play the part. You bowed at the right times. You nodded during sermons. You said, "Yes, Father," and "Thank you, my Lord," and kept your real thoughts buried so deep, even you weren't sure what they were anymore. Obedience became a survival tactic. Children learned early. How to be quiet. How to act small. How to avoid the priest's gaze. How to pray just loudly enough to be heard, but not so loudly that it sounded rehearsed. Dreaming big was a risk. Dreaming at all was something you did with your eyes open and your mouth shut. And religion, it was a leash, a holy one, sure, decorated with gold leaf and scripture, but a leash nonetheless. Weekly reminders that suffering made you holy, that disobedience led to hell, that the only freedom worth having came after death. Meanwhile, Father Thomas slept in a room with a door that closed properly, drank wine you'd never taste, and reminded you often that heaven was a reward for humility. His humility, your suffering. But you still listened. Because what else could you do? Hope was the only thing no one taxed. At night, the village grew quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. You lay on your straw bed, listening to the fire pop and the wind scrape against the walls, and you thought about how many of your choices weren't really yours, how you obeyed. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because in winter, rebellion froze. Resistance starved. And thinking too loudly could be dangerous. So you wrapped yourself in wool. You sealed your thoughts inside your head. You turned toward the fire and said nothing. Because in the medieval world, survival wasn't about strength. It was about silence. Spring doesn't arrive with a celebration in the medieval world. There's no sudden chorus of birds, no sunbeam bursting through the clouds like a divine promise. It creeps in slowly, cautiously, like it's checking if winter finally fell asleep. The snow doesn't melt. It sulks, turns to slush, then mud. Thick, clinging, ankle-deep mud that threatens to eat your boots, your patience, and sometimes your livestock. Everything is soaked. Everything stinks. And somehow, despite being warmer, the cold feels worse. Damp and clingy, like regret wrapped in a wet cloak. But you get up anyway, because spring, even in all its soggy, miserable glory, means one thing: work. The fields need plowing, the tools need sharpening, the seeds need blessing, and none of it will wait. The land isn't gentle, it's demanding. You owe it everything: your past, your present, your next meal. You pull the plow behind a reluctant ox who's just as fed up as you are. The wooden blade struggles through the heavy soil. Your hands blister. Your back screams. But you keep going, because if you don't plant now, you don't eat later. The grain stores are almost gone. What's left is riddled with weevils or mold. You eat it anyway. You tell yourself it's fine. You ignore the stomach cramps. You can't afford to care. This is the hunger gap, the cruel stretch between when last year's food has run out and this year's harvest hasn't even begun. It's when people get desperate. It's when hope feels like a joke. The weather plays games. One day, it's sun. The next, frost. You watch the sky, like it owes you answers. It doesn't. The rain falls when it wants. The wind blows when it's least helpful. You plant in faith and fear. The animals stumble out of their winter slump. The chickens start laying again cautiously. The cow moos like she's seen things no creature should see. Everyone's skinny. Everyone's mean. But alive, that counts for something. The village changes. Slowly. People open their doors. Air out the damp. Sweep out the soot. Men gather in the fields. Women hang laundry that's somehow still wet. Children play in puddles and get yelled at for getting too close to the edge of everything. You hear laughter for the first time in months. Not loud, not free, but it's there. And maybe you smile a little. The church announces feast days. You attend them, not because you feel like celebrating, but because it means music, bread, maybe even meat. You bow your head. You sing the hymns. You cross yourself and pray. Not just because it's expected, but because part of you believes. You walk past the graveyard. You count the new stones. Too many. Winter took people you knew. You say their names under your breath. You don't stop walking. The market road begins to fill again. Peddlers return dragging carts of threadbare goods and spoiled herbs. You trade what little you have for what little you need. A tin cup, a patch of leather, a needle that isn't bent in half. No one smiles much, but no one curses either. That's improvement. Spring cleaning is less about tidying and more about survival. You patch the roof again, mend the fence, pull dead things out of the garden. You pretend you don't see the rat skulls under the bed or the mold spreading across the wall. You make soap from ashes and lard. You scrub everything until your hands bleed. You cough less now. The smoke finally escapes. The house breathes again, and so do you. Washing yourself is an event. You heat water. You pour it into a cracked tub. You scrub with a cloth that's seen too many winters. It hurts. It stings. It feels like being reborn in a bucket. Your clothes are still rags, but they're cleaner rags. That's progress. Your hands shake less. Your feet stop swelling. The blisters turn to calluses. Your skin remembers what it feels like not to be constantly raw. You start to stretch in the mornings without groaning. You feel alive. Not healthy, not safe, but upright. That counts for a lot. There's a moment, a brief fleeting moment, when you step outside just after dawn. The sky's a pale gold. The air smells of wet earth and something sweet you can't name. And for the first time in what feels like forever, you don't shiver. You close your eyes. You take a breath, and you realize you made it. Not everyone did, but you did. You endured the hunger, the sickness, the cold, the silence, the sermons, the cracked ribs and the bruised heels and the endless aching monotony of survival. You buried your neighbors. You sang at their graves. You held your child's hand through a fever. You stitched your clothes by firelight with numb fingers. You chased off a fox. You patched the same hole in the roof 5 times. You lived. Spring doesn't reward you with gold. It doesn't restore what winter took, but it offers something else. A second chance. A new rhythm. The sound of birds. the green of shoots, the promise of something growing again. And you go back to work. Because in this world, life is never given. It's taken, grasped, gritted through. You feed the animals. You till the soil. You sew another patch on your sleeve and hope this one lasts longer than the last. You tell your children that spring is coming even when it's already here. Because saying it out loud makes it real. And you keep moving because that's what medieval survival is. Not triumph, not glory, not victory, just movement, just enduring, just continuing through hunger, through darkness, through grief, until the next spring. And the one after that, because somehow, despite everything, you're still here.